Morning by Ken Blockus, and it's January 21st, 1999, and we're in the Greener home. We want to thank Marlene and Arden for this interview. This material will be used to interpret the heritage of our region. It'll be used for educational purposes and possibly economic development and tourism. And we'd like to start out with Marlene. And Marlene, would you like to tell us about your family background, name, birth?
My parents were Amelia and Fred Weedo. I was born in Claremont, but I have lived in Elgin all of my life. I have an older brother, Vernon, a younger sister, Glenda, and a younger brother, Russ.
Do you have any knowledge about your great-grandparents, or did any of them immigrant to the United States?
Yes, my mom's parents, Henry Miller and Mary Muhlenthaler, both came from Switzerland. And as far as my dad's parents, I'm not sure.
Arden?
I was born in Manchester. I was the son of Clarence and Edna Greener. I'm an only child. I was born in 1936, and I lived in Manchester from then until 1958, when I moved to Elgin. My heritage is also Swiss. In fact, my maternal grandparents were both Swiss immigrants. And we found out after we were married, although we knew that our heritage was both Swiss, that the grandparents came from the same canton or state in Switzerland. However, there is quite a difference, because most of the people from the Elgin area came from the area around Bern in Switzerland. And if you were around Bern in Switzerland, except for the architecture, you'd think you were around Elgin. The hills roll just like around Elgin. It's very similar. It's easy to see why the people in Elgin came from that area and why they settled here. My grandparents, even though they are in the same canton, it's the very south end of the canton, and the train has to put a cog down twice to get up the side of the mountain to get to the little town of Grindelwald, where my grandparents came from. But it's really, it's only, I suppose, in U.S. it'd be about 40 miles apart that our grandparents came from.
Now we'd like to move into your education, and maybe you can start like you would start with your elementary education in Elgin and go on through whatever training you had.
Okay, I went to the old Elgin school from day one. That's the only school building I was ever in. Our elementary grades were downstairs. When you moved into junior high and high school, you went upstairs. And after graduating from Elgin High School, I immediately went to work at a big game feed company in West Union. Worked there for 4 years and then got married.
Okay, Arden?
My schooling was done in what was then Manchester Independent School District. I was not like Marlene, because of course the town was somewhat larger. I went to a primary building through the first grade. Kindergarten and first grade was in one building, and then a block away was the building in which I went second through 8th grade. It was a 3-story building, and you kept working your way up. The junior high was on the top floor, and then Manchester High School. Graduated in 1954. From then I went on to the University of Iowa and graduated from there in 1958. And that's when I came to Elgin. And while I've had lots of jobs, I only had one major career job. I started teaching in Elgin in 1958, and 35 years later retired, took early retirement. I put myself through college as a carpenter, and I've worked as a plumber. I have driven a fuel tank wagon, many different things like that, and now that I'm semi-retired, I'm a piano tuner.
You have been a jack of all trades.
Maybe master of none.
Oh, I think you've been master of plenty. Okay, Marlene, would you like to tell about how you met and getting married?
We met in the winter of 1958. Wasn't that when you
Mhm.
were in that Messiah?
Mhm.
And some friends of mine invited me to go to Manchester to the Messiah that Arden was taking part in. And actually, I think that's the first time we met. But then we didn't date or anything until the next summer. And that would have been probably about a year and a half before we got married.
And what residencies have you lived in?
In Elgin, you
Mhm,
mean?
mhm.
We lived for 1 year in an apartment above what was Fob's garage. And then we rented a little house uptown where Ruth Metzger lives right now
Mhm.
for 3 years, and then we've been in this house since 1964.
And how many houses have you lived in all of your life in Elgin?
Oh boy. Let's see. 6 altogether.
6.
Uh-huh.
And Arden, how many homes have you lived in?
Gee, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 prior to my coming to Elgin. And then the first year that I was in Elgin, I just had a room with Mrs. Ida Grader.
Mhm.
The second year I was in Elgin, another teacher and I shared a trailer. So there's 2 more, and then the apartment above Fob's garage, the Metzger house, and then our own home since 1964.
Very good. Sometimes we get going and almost forget this. Why don't you tell us about your family right now, so we'll get your children?
Our family, we have 2 children. Alan is a music teacher at Shenandoah High School. And Angela lives in Brooklyn, Iowa. She's married to Peter Drahozel, who is a band instructor. And Annie works as a teacher's aide this year, this year in Brooklyn.
Now we're going to move back in time, and we'd like to have you think about your childhood. When I say childhood, what memories come to your mind? And we'll start with Marlene.
Okay, I remember we lived over in Canada when I was...
Can you tell us where Canada is?
The little square across the bridge in West Elgin.
Sometimes when I play these tapes back, I think, now if 20 years from now, will these people know some of these things? I try to think of it that way, so go ahead.
Okay, when I started to school, we naturally walked from up there. There were no lunches at noon, so we walked home for lunch. It was a neat place to live. I remember we had real good sledding in the wintertime, and all the kids from downtown would come up in the evenings, and we had a lot of fun with that.
Did you go to Cooley Hill?
Well, not as much as just right up there.
In
The
Canada?
Cappers lived up at the top of the square, and you could go on the hill clear up behind their house, which would be like where Marlotte's live now,
Mhm.
up there, and go all the way down across the bridge, because the bridge was right at the edge of the road, or it was straight down across at that time. And going over to, it was Lane Bumgartner's store at that time, for groceries. We did that.
Is that what later Halverson's store?
That was Harold Halverson's store later, but at that time, she was in there. That was a stopping off point for coming home from school. We'd stop in there almost every day. Then later we moved down, actually where the post office is right now. There was a house there. And we lived there for probably 5 years or so. And I remember Maynard Lance Barbershop was in the living room of our house.
Oh.
And so my sister and my bedroom was right upstairs over the barbershop. And I remember on Saturday nights, well, I think Wednesday nights too, they stayed open. And they stayed open late. Everybody came to get their hair cut on those nights. And it was a lot of times quite noisy down there until probably midnight or so.
Did you hear any good stories?
Probably we did. I remember he had a stove in there, and that stovepipe went right up through our bedroom. And so you could hear everything, that went on down there. And let's see, then we moved up to the little house across from the Elgin grade school. That's where we lived then through my high school years. And this is my doll from when I was probably 4 or 5 years old. It was stuck in the attic for many, many, many years. And when my cousin Alice Boyer started restoring dolls, she took it home, fixed it up. There she is. And she's sitting in a little rocker that belonged to my mom.
Did you have that recaned then?
Yes. Actually, Milton Miller did the restoring on that for us.
He did a lot of that work, didn't he?
Yes, he did.
Did Opal help with that too?
I think she did.
Or did she do the refinishing and he did the caning?
That could be. They worked together, I know, on the projects.
Not only did he recane it, he put new arms on it.
Yes, it was armless.
The arms had
when
been
Mom got
had been lost, and he did a wonderful job of. We've seen several
Matching
since.
it.
It's exactly the style, the cutout and so forth. Now with age, when he first did it, you could tell they had been restored. But now that's been 25 years ago, and now they're starting to take on the same patina. And we have to tell people that those are new arms on the old chair.
Well, you have mentioned a number of people that haven't been mentioned before, and so I'm really pleased. Do you have any other memories, or shall I move over to Arden?
Just growing up, you mean, in...
Any childhood memories? Maybe you want to think, and we'll go over. You can switch back and forth.
Go ahead.
Arden?
Well, my childhood memories are somewhat different. I grew up in what was basically a single-parent home. My mother was always working. However, my mother had 8 brothers and sisters, so in the summertime when school wasn't on, I would spend a lot of time with relatives, most of whom were on the farm close to Manchester. So while I was a town kid, I was also a country kid. I more or less grew up on the farm rather than in town, because I would spend my summers. One particularly, 2 different uncles that were real close, and spent most of my summers until I was about in 8th grade. As after that, then I generally had a job. I worked in a drugstore in Manchester until I was in college. I would work back in those days in towns that size. The stores were open like a drugstore had a soda fountain. It was open till 10 o'clock every night. So I'd go in after school and sometimes I'd work till 7 or 8 o'clock, sometimes till closing through that time. It was also then that I started working later in the high school. About the time I believe maybe the summer of my junior year, one of my uncles had retired from the farm, but he was a very, very good carpenter, so he did a lot of repair work for farmers in the area when they needed a few siding boards put on the barn, or some shingles replaced, or maybe even a new roof on the hog house. So that's how I kind of learned the carpenter trade, working for this uncle. And I did that a couple years, and then while I was in college I worked for a contractor building homes right there in Manchester. My childhood memories are, of course, as I said, my mother had lots of brothers and sisters, so while I was an only child, I had a big family.
You had an extended family.
Exactly, and they got together very often. And so my memories are of, my grandmother lived with us too. Well, in fact, she didn't die until after Marlene and I were married. And
in the same house?
In the same house, yes. My mother and I and my grandmother. And so on Christmas Eve, everybody that was there would gather at our house, for instance, and those sorts of things. It was, well, like I say, while I was from a small family, we really had a large family.
I didn't realize that you had spent time on the farm, so now I will ask a question about REC. Do you have any, when you went to the farm, did you ever go when they didn't have electricity?
Oh, yes.
Would you like to tell about that? Because the REC is paying for this copying of the tapes.
And I think Marlene would have a story like that too. No, one of my uncles, in fact, the only uncle that I currently have left, and he and his wife are both in a care center. But I can remember, prior to World War II, had an 80-acre farm, and that was pretty good. And he could see, he wasn't that old a person, and he could see that that wasn't going to make it. And so he moved, did some trading, and in fact, he ended up with over 2,000 acres down in Delaware County. But the first farm then of any size that he moved to, which would have been about 1945, did not have electricity. There was still the old Delco plant in the basement that some of us remember, where you had one whole wall full of batteries and the gasoline engine that charged up the batteries, and I believe it was like a 32 volt system throughout the farm, and that had kind of it worked sort of, but during the war they couldn't get parts for it, couldn't get repairs for it, and so it was pretty well off. So basically it was lanterns everywhere on this farm, and it was, I think, probably 1946. This was down near the village of Prairieburg, and I think it was about 1946 before REC came in there. But it was REC who did that. But I can remember lots of time spent at that place with the lanterns and so forth, because the Delco plant was over the hill and it was wartime and they couldn't do anything about it. And I think not one of your uncles also?
Yes, we thought that was a real neat thing when we would go out. It was to the Boyer farm, Alice.
Now, where would that
her
be?
home.
Brainerd?
Near Brainerd. And we spent a lot of time out there as it was, but I can remember going out there and you ate with the lamp on the table. We would play games and they had the lamps. And
What games did you play?
one I remember especially, Uncle Wiggly. We loved Uncle Wiggly.
Those cards.
Yeah.
Yes. And I don't remember, checkers maybe, and a lot of things, but we loved it out there. We spent a lot of time out there, and they had no electricity whatsoever. I don't remember what year they got it then. I just don't know.
Thinking back to your very early, when you were very small, like under 10, what do you remember if I say the word roads?
Well, of course, I was under 10 during World War II, and I had an uncle an aunt who lived in Stanwood, and we would go down Highway 38, which was a state highway, and it was gravel most of the way. Now, it was gravel, but that was quite an excursion, and of course, I can remember we didn't go far back in those years, but you couldn't go, the speed limit, I believe, was 35 miles an hour. I wonder how we got anywhere. And I remember that one of my uncles lived on a county line road. You could relate to that, between Buchanan and Delaware County. And it was, without a doubt, the worst maintained road I have ever seen. Neither county wanted to do it. Neither county owned it. They owned it together. And they finally, I remember in later years, worked out an agreement that, but basically they didn't do anything with it. And it was the worst road, and it had the worst snow removal and so forth. Basically, the county that I grew up in, of course, Delaware County, the roads are laid out in square miles. It isn't like the roads up in this corner of Fayette County. So they were a little easier to maintain, and the county roads basically were quite good. There was, I can remember lots of places, well, even when I would drive when I was first here, I couldn't drive to Elgin the first year that I taught here unless I drove way out of the way without driving on some gravel.
That's true. When I came here in 1951, many roads came to Elgin, but they were, the only one that was Elgin Claremont was the only one that was
Right.
blacktop.
Well, I would have it from Wadena to Arlington, I would have gravel, or if I went over through Volga, I would have from Volga to 56, which was gravel, and so there, lots of that.
While you've been taught, do you have anything about roads?
Just that they were gravel, that's about all I remember. We really did not go very far to West Union.
When Marlene and I were
Um,
dating, she was living in West Union, and I was living in Elgin, and that road was gravel.
That road was
And it was a
gravel.
mess sometimes.
Yes.
But I will say, you people are a little bit younger than we are, and so you kind of did not experience the mud roads
No.
that many of the people have
No.
talked about.
No,
No.
not really.
We didn't.
Okay, several times when you've been talking, you've mentioned the war years, and so that makes me kind of realize that you were old enough to have memories about those years. Would you like to share those with us? We'll start with Marlene.
I don't remember that much about it. I do remember my cousin, Gerald Boyer, was 18 years old when he left. I vaguely remember him being at our house before he left. He was my cousin and also Vernon's good friend. And then he was, killed shortly thereafter on Christmas Eve. And I also remember one day, Gerald Bolin was a pilot, and he flew over Elgin. You remember that, Ken? About as low as the water tower.
I remember.
And that sticks in my mind. Aside from that, I just don't remember that much about it.
What about you, Arden? Now, we're talking about World War II. I need to put something in your pocket.
Well, I remember a little more. I had an aunt and uncle on my father's side who lived in Chicago. And of course, back in those days, the trains ran everywhere, and occasionally my mother and I would board the train right there in Manchester and take it directly to Chicago. And we would visit. And we were visiting in this aunt and uncle's home on December 7th, 1941. We were in Chicago. And I remember being very, very upset because we were in Chicago and we were supposed to be doing stuff. I was 41, I would have been 5 years old, just had turned 5 years old. And we were supposed to be doing stuff. We were supposed to be out shopping and this and that. And all anybody wanted to do was sit around and listen to the radio. And like I say, I can remember being very disgusted about the whole thing because I really didn't understand at that time what it meant.
Feel, I mean, you were probably too young, but I remember December 7th very much, but I was terribly frightened. But maybe you didn't.
I don't think so. No,
Because I was
no.
older than you.
Yeah, I don't think that that entered at the time. And I remember then, it all goes back, we had had a fire when I was about 3 in a home that we lived in. And there was some faulty wiring in the attic and the fire wasn't bad, but it left quite an impression on me. And of course, when we went to movies then during the war, we saw newsreels all the time. And there was lots of fire in these newsreels. And so there was quite a time when I didn't want to go to the movies because I just really was worried about that fire and kind of associating the two. But my other recollection of it is at the end. I don't remember how long the whistles blew and the cars were honking their horns and
You just can't forget how excited everyone was.
Oh yeah. Mm-hmm.
Do you remember anything about rationing? I have my ration book.
Oh yes. We used to, of course, again, it was a big family, and I remember they used to kind of pass the ration books around. If you had a few extra sugar stamps, and maybe somebody needed something else, why they passed them back and forth and so forth. I guess I do have a couple of other recollections. I had 2 cousins that were in the Marines, and they were obviously older than I. My mother was the youngest of the family, and so although I do have a number of cousins that are younger, I have an awful lot of them that are older. 2 were in the Marines, and they were close to one another as they hopped the islands through the South Pacific, and one was killed on Okinawa. And I, of course, then remember going to the memorial service and that sort of thing. But I was pretty young, and it really did have probably didn't have the effect on me that it would have a few years later.
I would like to ask you, Marlene, if you could think back as far as you can go, what Elgin was like, I mean, downtown Elgin. And then I'll ask Arden what it was like when he came in 1954, and we'll get a little contrast, okay?
Okay, downtown Elgin we had the blacksmith shop, we had Phil Moser's wagon shop. Going on down the street, Leo Fobb's Grocery, I remember. Of course, the Lower Tavern, the drugstore with the soda fountain, which we loved.
And Chuck.
And Chuck O'Neill, Louis Klingman in there. And, let's see, Turkelson's. Then there was the Mulford Produce. Bill Moore's Variety Store was where later the liquor store was. Dr. Wolf's office upstairs. And let's see, the Echo was down that way.
The
Klingman's. Oh yes, the Opera House. I do remember the Opera House well. I think,
Arden missed that one.
yes.
That was gone.
I'm not sure, did that burn down like in about 52 or
51.
51 or
The
52?
year I came, and that's all people could talk about.
Uh-huh, was the Opera House burning down. And the Coffee Cup Cafe was the place for everybody. That's where they were always open after basketball games, in the evenings they were open. Spent a lot of time in there.
Would you tell us a little bit about the size of that cafe?
I think they probably had about 6 booths, maybe. A few stools. Very small, very, very small.
But it was always
But
packed.
it was always packed. And everybody would go to the Coffee Cup for a mud.
A mud.
They had their own special, Cliff would make a mud. It was in a little Coke glass, 2 scoops of ice cream, chocolate syrup, and malt powder sprinkled on top. And that was a mud. And you'd say that to people from other towns, they had no idea what you were talking about. And let's see, Tillotson's. Les Lehman's store was up on the corner. I remember that. And of course the co-op was back across from the Baptist church, and then that later burned.
And the implement shop burned.
Yes, the implement was down there, forgot about that too.
Elgin has had a lot of fires.
They have, yes they have. And of course, our house stood where the post office is now, and the post office was over right beside the bank. That was a very little building too, dark and dreary.
Yes, it was dark and very okay. And now Arden, how had it changed? What changes did you
Well,
see when you, what was your interpretation when you came? I know what mine was. What did you think when you
Well,
came?
of course, it was quite different for me. You almost, I don't know if you'd call it culture shock or anything, but I had grown up in a town somewhat larger than West Union, and then been in Iowa City for 4 years. So it was a bit of a change to come to a town this size. But there were lots of things in Elgin then. There really were. The businesses were a little different. Let's see, if we go down the north side of the street, Fobb's Garage was there, and then the City Hall and the library, and then Phil Moser's shop was still in the shop when I came there.
In the 50s.
In the 50s, and then Frieden's Grocery Store and Locker, and Maynard Lance's Barber Shop was next door to that, and then the tavern, and Leo Fobb, and then the Roberts had a cafe there, Leonard and Margaret, and another tavern, and the drugstore. The soda fountain was gone from the drugstore by the time I came to town. Louis and Chuck were obviously still in there. And then the garage, but then what apparently where the Opera House had been was kind of the used car lot, I think. By then there was still an old tin shed kind of affair down there on this side of where Dale Ellis's live, which apparently, they said that had at one time been the Echo, as I understood it. That
I've
had
heard
built,
that too.
the Elgin Echo, apparently, that's what some of the old timers said. And of course, then Don Fauser was in the station. And going down the other side of the street from the furniture store, of course, then there was a person named Pixler had just bought the hardware store. I believe it was an offshoot from one in Fayette, and they didn't have it very long, and the roof caved in and what have you, and they just tore it all out of there. But there was still a hardware store there on the corner when I came to town.
And that's where the parking lot.
Where the parking lot is, and then John Tillotson, well, there was a Frosty Welch's insurance office was in the little part of Tillotson's building there. And, because I remember we used to have Lions Club board meetings in there. And then John just basically didn't have a hardware store, it was just a plumbing and heating business there in the next, and then he, after the other hardware store folded and Gearing's folded in the upper part of town, then he put the hardware line in.
Now, excuse me, but where did the Meinhardts come in there?
They had the store that was on the corner where they sold it to Pixlers, as far as I know.
Well, they were before Pixels.
Between Les Lehman there on the corner, wasn't that it, Marlene? And then the Meinhardts had that store. I believe that's how it.
Because the Meinhardts were here, we've gotten a good view of what the town looked like at various stages. Because it was a bustling little town stuck down here with no main highway really going all the way through.
This is incredible. I would explain to people, what do you want to live in that small town for? Hey, that's not a normal small town. At that time we had, there was a doctor, there was a drugstore, there was a funeral parlor, we could take care of everything. There were 2 garages, a large implement dealership, just so much going on, a good business for a town this size. Nobody believed that.
Canning factory
Canning
and
factory
the hatchery.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I can remember from Manchester, this is another childhood memory. My uncles and aunts that raised chickens used to come, they would come to Elgin for chicks. They'd drive to Elgin for chickens.
We're going to move on a little bit, and I would like to ask you, when you were a child, what did you do for entertainment? What did you do? Movies, dances, hunting, traveling, relative visiting? Marlene?
Well, the sliding, I remember that, sledding. We didn't get very far away from here. There was a movie once a week that came to town. We always looked forward to that. School activities, the basketball games, whatever, was going on at the school. Our family going out to the farm was, I suppose, maybe a couple times a week or more than that. We really loved that, spending time out at Boyer's farm.
Did you have a church affiliation?
Yes, at that time, we went to the Baptist church. My parents were lifelong members of the Baptist church, and then none of us joined that church. We all ended up being Methodists.
Okay. I think in connection right along here, would you like to tell about, you have your classmates and what you do quite often?
Well, we've had a 5-year reunion every year since we graduated, and always have a very good turnout. Of course, there were only like 26 or 7 in the class. But the year we were going to turn 50, this was Marcia Wolf's idea, that we get together for a long weekend someplace. There are 6 of us that do that. You want me to name who they are? Okay, it's myself and Pat Capper Anderson, Ruth Ann Mitz Van Bogart, Marcia Wolf, Nona Mork Sawyer, and Diane Meinhard Ferris. The year that we were 50, we went to Amana. Just got a motel, spent, I think it was 3 days there. And it was just a lot of fun. 5 years later, we all went to Denver, Colorado. Marcia made reservations up at Estes Park. We stayed with her, and then we went up there. And it's been really a lot of fun. This last year, it was the year we turned 60. We did that in Elgin. After that, I don't know. There's been talk of going to Diane's in Tennessee maybe the next time or something, but it's been a really neat thing to do.
It would be fun to visit each one in their own home area.
Yes, yes.
That would be a good idea. Do you remember any hunting, traveling, dances, movies? You did. Some of you have mentioned movies.
Yeah, movies. Yeah, we had of course a theater. I just lived 3.5 blocks from the local theater, so it was definitely a part of my growing up. Not much on the hunting side. Spent a lot of time outdoors. Lots of family things because of the large family that my mother came from. A little travel as I was growing up in the 40s. Nobody traveled a great deal until the late 40s. I do specifically remember in 1948 we took a trip with an uncle and aunt to Montana and went through the North Dakota Badlands and ended up at this little town of Roundup, Montana, where I had 2 uncles living that were on my father's side. They were both coal miners. Now, in Montana, you don't think of that as being a mining state, but there was a huge mine in this little town of Klein, and it was basically a company town. Every house looked alike, and they were all owned by the coal mine, which was owned by the Burlington Northern Railroad. And this mine provided all the coal for the railroad between Minneapolis and Seattle. And so it was a very, very large mine. One of my uncles was the superintendent of the mine, and another one was the fellow who stood at the bottom of the mine shaft and ran the elevator that took the cars up and down full of coal. And I was a junior high kid then, and they took me down in the mine and so forth. It was very, 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 very interesting. The mine is no longer there. In fact, Marlene and I and our children visited that town in 1972 and visited the one uncle that was still there, and the town is no longer there. The mine was closed after the railroad no longer needed coal, and it was a very, very deep mine, so it wasn't cost efficient to get the coal out. They bulldozed the shaft and moved the town is just no longer there. The houses are all gone, and it's just kind of a spot. But
You enjoyed it. It was one of your travels
that was one of the travels that I enjoyed. Another travel, the year that I graduated from high school, 1954, my mother and I, my mother was the Delaware County Treasurer for 27 years, and she knew all of the car dealers obviously very well, because at that time you couldn't do like you did. If you bought a new car, you had to license it immediately, and only the Treasurer's office could license a car. They couldn't provide you with a license like a dealer can now. And so any time of the weekend or whenever, nights, why she might get called out, and she was on really good terms with all the car dealers. Well, one of the car dealers had a brother who was a car dealer in Iowa City who had lots of connections with Amana Refrigeration, and he had sold a car to an Amana dealer, the Iowa City guy, to a Amana dealer in California. And so my mother and I ferried that car to California and flew home. And again, in the 50s, the plane ride was pretty awesome for someone who'd never been on one before.
I imagine the food was quite a bit better.
Yes, yes, yes.
Okay, Marlene, would you like to tell us a little bit about your years in the post office? You are now retired, and I will later on ask you a little bit about your retirement years.
Okay. I started to work in 1974 at a job that I was to work 3 hours on Saturday morning. That was it. And not more than 1 year went by, and it was more and more and more. Well, for 7 years I was clerk then, when Hank McMillan was the postmaster. And after 7 years, he retired. I applied for the postmaster job and got it. So for 17 years, I was the postmaster in Elgin.
Do you have any interesting experiences or humorous ones?
Well, probably the most humorous one is the first time that we got a cremated body in the mail.
You didn't know what to do with it?
I did not know. Marcia Miles was the clerk there at that time, and of course she knew what it was right away, and I didn't. And she says the look on my face when she told me, well, you know what this is. Said it all.
She said it all. What big changes have you seen in the post office?
Oh, automation, computerized. Everything was done, you know, you just did everything when we first started. Everything was done by hand, the forwarding of mail, everything. And now they don't do any of that. It's all, anybody's mail that's forwarded is sent in a package to Cedar Rapids, where it's forwarded from there.
Oh, it goes to, I thought it went to Decorah.
No, it goes to Cedar Rapids, the forwarding.
Oh, the forwarding.
All of our mail goes to Decorah.
Yes. I mean,
every
even
day.
if I want to send something to Claremont, I should take it to Claremont, because otherwise
It goes to Decorah.
it goes to Decorah first, and we call that progress.
When I started to work, they had, well, just before that, they had 3 clerks and a postmaster. Now there's a postmaster and 1 clerk that works 2 hours a day.
My goodness, that is change, isn't it?
Yes, it is. And not all for the good either, because the mail volume has increased tremendously. And it's just always to save.
And the second grade would come to visit the post office.
Yes.
And you would give them a ride on the cart.
On the cart. They always enjoyed that, and we really enjoyed having them come every year too. It was fun. The cart and the safe. They loved the safe.
Well, yes. Okay.
The Elgin history book does say that Marlene would have been the 23rd postmaster in Elgin. Now, actually, there have been 25, but one guy around the turn of the century served 3 different times, about a year or so. But she's the 20. She was
Since
the 20,
1854.
Yeah, she's the 23rd,
first year.
and her tenure would have been the 3rd longest. Hans Kaiser and Hank McMillan were in place longer than she. And also, Marlene won't tell you this, but she was the first postmaster that was not a purely political appointment. Hers was a competitive appointment, not a. Prior to that, well, a few years prior to her appointment, all of the postmasterships were.
Till the reorganization
Yeah, till it
in
was
71.
Yeah.
and then was that when they started the testing, or did they have that before?
They always had the test, the civil service test, to get hired by the postal service, but to become a postmaster now, you have to go through the competitive process of applying for the job and
Do you have interviews in?
and yes.
Every person who worked in the post office for years took the civil service test and was hired, but the postmasters were appointed.
Mm-hmm.
Oh,
That was a
okay.
political appointment.
Mm-hmm.
Good. I'm glad you brought that out, that we had that change. Okay. Arden, would you like to tell us how you came to Elgin, your first connection with Elgin, and why you came here to teach, and about your teaching years?
My first memory of Elgin is my high school band director and Leo Grader, who was the band director in Elgin at that time, were good friends. And Leo was seeing the need for something a little better down in the local park for the band concerts that they did in the summertime. And so he arranged an exchange concert with Manchester. And I think this was maybe in 1955, although I don't recall, maybe Marlene would remember.
I don't
You-
know, probably.
Yeah.
would have been.
Anyway, my first memory of Elgin was sitting on the back of a lumberyard truck in the trombone section of the Manchester band, because the bandstand wasn't large enough to hold everybody, the one that existed in Elgin. So they'd back 2 big trucks, one for the drummers and one for the low brass, of course, sort of on the side of that. I believe it was like an 8-sided deal. I can't remember just what shape it was, but anyway, that was my first recollection of Elgin. Then later, when I was a senior in college, I was in the University of Iowa band, obviously, and we played a concert at Valley High School, which was its first year of existence, in the spring of 1958. And Leo knew I was graduating, and he had been in Manchester different times to criticize groups and that sort of thing, work with as a consultant with groups, and so he kind of knew me and mentioned to me that he was leaving, and would I be interested in applying for the job, and if so, I should do so. And so the very next week I applied for the job. I came to, it was the week before Easter in 1958, I do remember that. I came up and had an interview on a Saturday, and I thought the interview went pretty well, and yes, they would get back to me. And I drove back to Manchester, and by the time I got back to Manchester, there was a phone call that I was being offered the job. Would I like to drive back and sign a contract? So I did. And so of course, like many young teachers, I was going to stay here 3 or 4 years and then move on to someplace larger. Well, in 3 or 4 years turned into 35. I knew what was here, I guess, is one of the reasons that I had interviews in several different places, and I was offered a couple of other different jobs. But I knew what a fine job that Leo Grader had done with the music department here. So it was a case that this was one that I knew what I was stepping into, rather than just going into a job blind. And I guess that's what sort of tipped the scales in terms of coming to Elgin. As far as what tipped the scales of staying there, it just was a great place to raise a family. It was a good school system. There was lots of community support for the program that I was involved with, and we talked about different times, and we couldn't see anything that looked any better than what we had. So that was why we're here.
You want to comment on your years? I think this area, sometimes we've been strong in sports, and sometimes we haven't been, but we've almost always been strong in music, or people have been very unhappy.
Yeah, the program was probably strong because it's first of all, the heritage of the people around here was a very musical one. There was lots of music in the community. Elgin had its little, what they called the Little Swiss Band. It started out to be the Little German Band, and it then later years was called the Little Swiss Band. That was pretty well over the hill by the time that I got here, although they did get together one time after I was here, but they were just, most of the gentlemen were old enough that it didn't go over. It was more of a nostalgia thing than it was a great musical experience at that time, and yet I'm told, in looking at the music that they played, incidentally, it's kind of, it's a little bit humorous. They were called the Little Swiss Band or the Little German Band. Most of the music they played was Czech.
Polka, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was polka style,
Polka.
and I still have in my possession most of the music that the Little Swiss Band played. It was given to me by Louis Thoma and Gladys Shorey, and I've just kind of hung on to it, and someday a bunch of it will probably go to the Historical Society just to look at or whatever. But as it turned out, most of that music was Czech. It's a company named Vitak published most of it, but it was something the town was really proud of, and so music has been an Elgin thing for a long time, and of course the parental support for that sort of thing was good, and that's why it flourished.
And how many years were you the band director at Valley?
I was band director 35 years. I've been retired since 1993.
You enjoyed those years?
Oh, very much. Yeah. Well, there are always ups and downs in any job, but yeah, it was very enjoyable.
Your bands did very well.
Thank you.
Do you have any funny stories to tell?
Oh dear. I think maybe the funniest one was about the second year I taught. I would always tell people when they were marching, if you drop something, leave it lay. Don't break ranks, leave it lay. I don't care if you don't play or whatever. Well, we were marching. That's just when the football field, the school was out at Valley, but the football field was still in Elgin. And who was it? I can't remember who was playing bass drum.
Was it Stan Anderson?
It might have been Stan Anderson. It might have been Fremont Ogle. I wouldn't say. Anyway, we're marching down the field in two long lines, and whoever was playing bass drum dropped one of the sticks. So bails out, runs back, grabs the sticks, and of course by that time the band is another 20 yards down the field, and so here's this kid with a bass drum hanging on the front of him, racing to catch up with the rest of the band. Things like that. Yeah, there are lots of really, really fond memories. We did a lot of traveling in later years with the band, and introducing kids to new things. The first time we took the band to Florida, only 3 of the 62 had ever been there. The year that we took them to New Orleans, none of them had ever been there. And so those sorts of things were fun.
Well, we really want to thank you both for your contributions in the post office and at the school with the music, and I'm sure it helped carry on the tradition. We had a few years when the band kind of went downhill, but now, the other day when I was subbing, the whole class, but except 2, went to be in the 5th grade band.
Well, that's great.
And I thought you would be interested in knowing
That's good
that.
to
And
hear.
so some of your heritage is, picks up, you know, again. Now I'd like to ask you, you told why you wanted to stay and live in this area, but if you met somebody and they were looking for a place to live, why would you tell them to come to Elgin, Marlene?
Well, I think it's a very nice place to live. It's a very pretty area. It has, I think, a lot to offer. Beyond that, I don't know.
Do you want to add anything other than what you've already told us?
Well, it just has a lot going for it. It's large enough to have most of the things. I'm sure, just like any place, we can always wish we had this or we had that. But you can meet your basic needs here really quite handily, and yet it isn't so large that you don't know your neighbors. It's sort of like they say that nobody uses their turn signal in Elgin because everybody knows where everybody's going. It's small enough that everybody knows you, and they kind of look out for one another. Like we just got back from a 3-week jaunt, and we've.
Would you tell us where you've been?
Well, we had a little different experience. We rode an Amtrak to Los Angeles, had a car waiting for us there. We then drove the Pacific Coast Highway, Highway 1, to Seattle, and that's quite an experience. It's a beautiful drive. It's not a drive you can make any time on, but it's a beautiful drive. We visited Pat Hansen, who was a dear friend and a former teacher in Seattle. And then came back to San Francisco, spent a couple of days there, and boarded the Amtrak, went to Denver, spent a couple of days with Marlene's classmate, Marcia Wolf, and then on to, actually we got off in Omaha. Our son is in Shenandoah, and so it was close, and he picked us up in Omaha. But it was kind of neat 3 weeks, and we didn't worry about a thing, because just gave the neighbors the key to the house, and I had a little light fixed up. You can buy a little thermostat now that you can plug a lamp into, and if the temperature drops below a certain preset degree, the light comes on, and so they could see the light in the window in case there was a problem, as far as the furnace was concerned. And
Where did you find that?
down at the hardware store.
Hey, we better get one.
Definitely.
That's, now that you're retired, you know, we've been retired for longer than you have, so, but your plans are to do some traveling?
Oh, yes. We hope to. I haven't been retired long enough to know what it's all about yet.
Yes, that's what
It's
I was
only
gonna
2
say.
months, and we went away for 3 weeks. Had the Christmas holiday in between. So I'm just looking forward to doing a lot of things that I haven't had time, and
We already have another trip planned. We're going to Texas in May. My high school class reunion is having a reunion in Texas. One of our classmates is a retired radiologist and now has a kind of a hobby ranch where he raises cattle, and so we're going to go to, that class is going to have a reunion at his ranch north of Dallas in May, and so we'll probably take well, I know we're gonna take extra time and stop in Branson and a few things like that.
Sounds
So
good.
that's,
And looking forward to homecoming, of course, this summer.
Yes. Oh, that's something we didn't ask you about. Do you have any homecoming memories?
I don't think anything special. It just every 5 years, it's something that a person really looks forward to, seeing everybody come back and
And what anniversary is it for Elgin this year?
150.
150, yes. 150. Two times ago, I did have an experience with homecoming. I was the general chair of the whole thing, along with Bev Frederick's help, and that was an experience. You find out what all there is to do.
A lot of work.
But yes, it is, but it was worth it.
What do you think is the future for those homecomings? Do you think we're going to be, we went from, did you ever have them every 2 years, or has it been just 3 and 5?
I think it's just 3 and 5.
They were 3 years when I came to town
Uh-huh.
first.
Then they decided the 5 years was I hope it continues.
It's a good, I think it's something that people enjoy and people come back and like to see
yes.
where,
And there's some side effects. Everybody spruces up a little bit, and
Yes.
it really
That's
works.
a big thing, yes.
It works good for the town that way.
before we close, I would like to ask, if you have anything that you thought of while we were talking that I haven't asked you that you would like to share.
I don't